The house smelled of beeswax and old wood exactly as she remembered it. Cecily Vane set the linen register on the hall table and did not let herself look at the portrait above the staircase. She had managed 3 days without looking at it. She told herself she would manage a 4th. The October light came thin through the fanlight above the door, and the footman who had admitted her, a young man she did not know and hired after her time, was already retreating toward the green baize door at the corridor's end. She was alone in the entrance hall of Ashbrook Park. The home she had fled 5 years ago in the dark of a January night, wearing a borrowed cloak and a name she had taken from her mother's maiden cousin, stood around her in polished, reproachful silence. She had come back because she had run out of choices. That was what she told herself, and it was true as far as it went. The position had been advertised in the Warwickshire Gazette under the name of the estate's steward, Mr. Gendo. Beaufort Kirk, who did not know her and had never met her, she had written as Mrs. Cecily Ward, widow, formerly employed in 3 respectable households, references available upon application. Mr. Kirk had replied within a fortnight. The Marquessate of Ashbrook required a housekeeper of experience and discretion. The previous incumbent had retired. The new position carried a salary of £48 per annum, a room in the East Wing, and Mr. Brew. Kirk had noted in a postscript she suspected he had been required to include the particular circumstance that his lordship, the Marquess of Ashbrook, was himself in residence and received reports on household matters directly each Thursday morning. She had read that postscript 4 times. Then she had folded the letter and posted her acceptance because the alternative was the workhouse, and she had a daughter to consider. If you have ever watched a woman hold her face very still while her whole interior life storms behind her eyes, you will understand what Cecily Vane looked like when she finally lifted her gaze to the portrait. He had not changed in the painting. He never would. 29 years old, dark coat, the jaw she had once traced with one finger in the quiet of an early morning, the gray eyes that had never been cold until the last night she saw them. 5 years. She had spent 5 years telling herself he must have remarried, that the mourning would have been observed and set aside, and that some appropriate woman of appropriate rank would have been installed in the rooms at the south end of the corridor, and that the portrait of the first Marchioness would have been moved to a lesser gallery, and that nothing of her remained here. The portrait was not in a lesser gallery, it hung exactly where it had always hung. She picked up the linen register. She went down the service corridor to find Mrs. Crean, Kirk, the steward's wife, who would show her the pantry rooms and the household accounts. She did not cry. She had finished crying before her daughter was born. Her name was Eleanor, and she was 4 years old, and she had her father's gray eyes, and she was in the village of Stonewell with Cecily's cousin Agnes for the fortnight it would take to arrange a proper situation. If the situation could be arranged, Eleanor would come. If it could not, Cecily would leave again, as quietly as she had arrived. That was the entire plan. It was not a good plan. It was the only one she had. The household of Ashbrook Park ran on a rhythm she knew from the inside. She had spent the first 8 months of her marriage learning it, before the accident, before the physician, before the series of terrible quiet conversations that had ended with Lord Ashbrook standing at the far end of the blue drawing-room telling her that she had deceived him, and that he required her to understand the gravity of what she had done. He had not shouted. He had never shouted. That had been, in some ways, the most frightening thing about him. The deception had not been what he believed it to be. She had spent 5 years knowing that, and having no one to tell. On the first Thursday morning, she presented herself at the library door at 9 o'clock sharp and knocked. "Enter," he said, and the sound of his voice through 2 inches of oak door was enough to make her left hand press flat against her skirt to keep it still. She opened the door. The Marquess of Ashbrook stood at the window with his back to her, looking out at the south lawn where the October light was still young and gray. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps 5 years of smaller rooms had recalibrated her sense of scale. His dark hair had a thread of silver at the temple that had not been there before. He did not turn immediately. She She had 4 seconds, and she counted them, to compose her face into the expression of a competent stranger. Then he turned, and she saw the precise moment his eyes registered something wrong. He did not move. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot reconcile, a face that should not be in this room, in this context, wearing this particular gray dress. She was thinner than she had been. She had changed her hair. She wore no jewelry, and had never worn any powder, and she had hoped these differences would be enough. They were not. Mrs. Zend. "Ward," he said, and his voice was perfectly controlled, and she understood from the particular quality of that control that he had already seen through her. "Sit down." She sat in the chair across from his desk because she could not think of a single reason to refuse him. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. The fire burned. Somewhere in the hall, a clock measured out the silence. "You are not a widow," he said at last. Her throat closed. She kept her hands in her lap and did not look away from him. "No, my lord. You have been in this house for 4 days. "Yes. You came because he stopped." He pressed one hand flat on the surface of his desk as though steadying himself. "You will tell me why?" And there it was. The question she had been composing her answer to for 5 years, which fell apart entirely, now that he was in the same room, and looking at her with those gray eyes that she had loved with the uncomplicated ferocity of a woman who had married at 19 and believed her happiness was simple. She told him the truth, or the beginning of the truth. She told him about the physician's letter, the one she had kept, the one that had arrived 2 weeks after she left, and had explained the matter her mother-in-law had told the Marquess as deliberate falsehood. She had not sent it on because she had believed at the time that a woman who had been called a deceiver in that voice, with that degree of cold precision, had no ground from which to offer a correction. She had taken the letter, and she had gone to Agnes, and Agnes had kept her, and she had made what life she could with what she had. He did not speak when she finished. She rose from the chair because sitting felt suddenly impossible. "I will collect my things and be gone before the noon hour. I would not have come at all, but I had very little left." "Sit down," he said, and there was something in his voice that she had not heard before. Not coldness, not command. Something fractured. Beneath the command, the way ice sounds when the river is moving under it in spring. She sat. "The letter," he said. "Do you have it still?" "I do. Show me." She reached into the inner pocket of her dress and produced it. She had carried it for 5 years. The paper had thinned at the folds. She set it on the desk between them and watched him read it, and she watched his face change as he read it, and she looked away before she could see what the change meant, because some things are too private to witness in a man's face, and she was no longer certain she had the right to witness anything of his. He read it twice. Then he set it on the desk and put his hand over his eyes. Perhaps now is the moment to say something about how the Marquess had spent 5 years. About the way the house had changed after she left, the rooms closed in sequence, the household reduced, the portrait that had never been moved, because he could not bring himself to move it, and could not explain why, without examining a grief he had spent considerable effort refusing to examine. About the way Mr. Dompley. Girk had come to him 6 months ago with a quiet concern about the management of the upper rooms, and the Marquess had told him to hire as he saw fit, because the particulars of domestic arrangement were more than he could attend to. And what he had been attending to instead was the management of an estate and a memory, and the particular discipline of continuing to live in a house that contained no one he wished to speak to. The land agent could have told you that his lordship worked 12 hours on some days and appeared to need nothing and felt nothing, and that this was worse than grief, which at least moved what the Marquess had was the thing after grief. It was the place where grief had calcified into habit. He had read her name in Mr. Kirk's correspondence and thought it a coincidence. Cecil Ward. Not the name, he knew. He had told himself it was a coincidence and had spent 4 sleepless days knowing it was not. "The physician's letter contradicts what I was told," he said at last, his hand coming down from his eyes. His face was composed. It cost him something to make it composed. She could see the cost, and she felt the old familiar weight of loving someone, She was not certain she was permitted to love. "Yes," she said. "My mother told me." "Yes." A silence. "My mother is dead," he said. She had not known that. Something in her expression must have shown it, because he nodded once, briefly, as though confirming a fact they were both required to absorb. 2 years ago, last March. She did not speak of you. I did not ask, because asking would have required me to admit I thought of you, which I was not prepared to do. He looked at his desk. You should not have left without a word. The thing she had been holding for 5 years rose in her chest, and required some violence to keep in place. You told me what you believed of me. I know what I told you. You told me that I had made a fool of you, and that you did not know how to look at me. I know that too. And you were not wrong, she said, about having been deceived. You were wrong about who had deceived you. The experience of having been deceived was real, and I had no right to require you to examine it on my timetable rather than your own, so I did not. He looked at her then. The look lasted a long time. You are the most precise woman I have ever argued with, he said. And the thing in his voice was not cold, and not distant, and not the formal register of a marquess reviewing his household staff. You were the most precise woman I had ever argued with when we were married, and apparently 5 years have not diminished the quality. She folded her hands in her lap. She did not smile, because smiling felt dangerous, and she was trying very hard to remain in the territory of practicality. I will still leave if you require it. I ask only that you allow me until the morning, as I have arranged my cousin to bring my things, and arriving before I have made alternative arrangements would present a difficulty. Your things, he said. And what else? She looked at her hands. My daughter. The silence in the library was enormous. She is 4 years old, Cecily said. She has not been told her father's name. I have told her only that her father was a good man who did not know she existed. That is the truth, as far as I know how to tell it. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her. Again, and she watched the breadth of his shoulders and the particular way he held himself when he was not certain what to do next, which was a thing she had learned in 8 months of marriage and had apparently retained with perfect fidelity across 5 years of determined forgetting. Thursday is 4 days from now, he said to the window. Yes, I would like you to remain in the position until Thursday. She waited. There are things I need to understand, he said, and I find that I cannot understand them if you are somewhere. I cannot speak to you. Stay until Thursday. We will speak again at 9 o'clock. It was not a warmth. It was not an apology. It was a command in the register of a man who had spent 5 years issuing commands, because commands were the only form of speech he trusted himself to use, and she heard inside it something she did not yet know what to do with. Yes, my lord, she said. She rose. She moved to the door. Cecily, it was the first time he had said her name. She stopped walking but did not turn around. The letter, he said. I will keep it. She went out and closed the door behind her. The 4 days between that Thursday and the next were among the strangest of her life, and her life had contained several candidates for that distinction. She managed the household. She reviewed the accounts with Mr. Kirk and found 3 areas of unnecessary expenditure in the kitchen and 1 in the stabling. She walked the upstairs rooms and noted what required airing and what required replacement. She directed the daily operations of a house she had once lived in as its mistress, with the careful professional competence of a woman who could not afford to be anything other than competent. And she heard through the regular channels of household information that the Marquess had ridden out before 7 each morning, and returned before dark and had eaten alone and had not received any callers and had spent the evenings in the library. On the 2nd day, she wrote to Agnes. On the 3rd, a letter came back. Agnes and Eleanor would arrive on Saturday, as planned. She folded the letter. She was sitting in the small room that served as the housekeeper's office, at a desk that had not been her desk in another life, and she permitted herself 2 minutes of something she would not name before she went back to the account books. He had not asked about the child's name. She had not told him. She thought about it from time to time. She thought about what it would do to him to know that she had looked at her daughter's gray eyes and known immediately what her name would be, and that the name she had chosen was the same name he had told her once had belonged to his grandmother, a woman of great steadiness, a woman worth remembering. Eleanor. The Thursday morning arrived with a frost on the south lawn and a fire already built in the library. She knocked at 9 o'clock. She entered at his word. She sat in the same chair. He did not begin with pleasantries. "I wrote to Ashfield Colton," he said. Ashfield Colton was the physician who had written the letter. She had not known he was still practicing. He replied yesterday evening by express. He has also confirmed what the record would show, had anyone consulted it at the time. He paused. "My mother made a representation to me that was not supported by the medical record. I did not consult the medical record because I believed her, and because I was." He stopped. He was a man for whom pauses cost something. "Because I had been told something that made me want to believe it, rather than question it." "You had wanted to be angry," she said. It was not an accusation. It was simply what she had always known. Yes, he met her eyes. "I had wanted to be angry because the alternative was grief, and I did not yet know how to grieve properly." He looked at the desk. "I have since learned." She thought of the portrait in the hall. She thought of the rooms that had been closed and the household that had been reduced, and the man who worked 12 hours a day and felt nothing. She thought of the very specific kind of ruin that comes from substituting anger for mourning, and then having the anger taken away. "I am sorry," she said. "For all of it. You have nothing to apologize for. I left without speaking. You had been told there was nothing to say." He looked at her. "I told you there was nothing to say. That was wrong." "I was wrong." The fire crackled. Outside she could hear the household beginning its mourning. She had not expected that. She had expected at best a formal acknowledgement of the factual record, and a question about the child, and a practical resolution involving some arrangement of allowance and quarterly meetings. She had not expected "I was wrong" from the Marquess of Ashbrook, who had been told from birth that his rank precluded the necessity of that particular sentence. "I have also," he said, "made inquiries about the matter of the marriage." Whether it stood, a pause that held itself very still. "It stands. There is no record of dissolution. The record shows a marchioness, living." She did not speak. "I am not," he said carefully, "telling you this to compel you. I am telling you because it is the truth, and you are a woman who has had enough untruths told in her vicinity. What you do with it is your decision." She thought of Eleanor's gray eyes. She thought of Agnes's kitchen, and the 4 years she had spent making herself small and provisional, and ready to move. She thought of the physician's letter she had carried for 5 years because she could not bear to destroy it, because destroying it would have meant deciding that his opinion of her was the final verdict. She had not been able to decide that. "I have a daughter," she said. "Her name is Eleanor. She has your eyes, which I found rather difficult to look at when she was an infant, and I find somewhat less difficult now, though only somewhat." She paused. "I should very much like her to know her father's name. I should like that considerably." He stood up again. He walked around the desk, which was a thing she had not expected, and she rose because sitting while he stood felt wrong, and then they were standing at a closer distance than was strictly necessary, and she could see the thread of silver at his temple clearly now. The way the morning light came off the south-facing window and fell across the line of his jaw. "On the matter of the household position," he said, his voice very controlled, "I find that I require a marchioness rather than a housekeeper. The distinction in terms of daily management may be slight, but the title differs substantially." It was the closest thing to a jest she had heard from him in 5 years, and she was so startled by it that she almost did not notice his hand coming up to her face. His fingers rested against her cheekbone with a precision that was not surgical and not tentative, but simply exact, the way he did everything, and the warmth of his hand against the cold of the room was enough to undo the last 5 years of careful management entirely. She did not cry. She put her hand over his, and he let out a breath that had been held for considerably longer than the duration of their conversation. "Thursday next," he said quietly. "I am informed there is a dinner at Caldwell House. The Viscount Caldwell and his wife. My neighbor, Lady Forston, will also be present. She has spent 2 years informing the county that I am too young to have given up entirely, and that my household is in a shameful state of disarray." "She is not wrong about the household," Cecily said. "No," he said, the very edges of his voice warming into something that was not quite amusement but was its near relation. "She is not." She understood what he was proposing. He was proposing that she stand beside him at a dinner table in the county, where she had once been known, in the company of people who had attended their wedding, and heard whatever the Dowager Marchioness had chosen to say in the 5 years between. He was proposing to introduce her, not as the woman who had vanished, but as the woman who had returned, without apology, in the particular way that required everyone else in the room to make whatever adjustment the facts required. She had spent 5 years making herself small. She had been rather good at it. The prospect of stopping felt like stepping onto ground that might or might not hold. She thought of Eleanor, who was afraid of nothing, who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's tendency to make up her mind before consulting anyone. "I will need something to wear that is not gray," she said. "The house accounts will manage it," he said. He dropped his hand from her face. He looked at her with an expression she had first seen 8 months into their marriage, on a morning in the library not unlike this one, when she had said something he did not expect, and had found that he minded considerably less than he thought he should. "The dressmaker in Warwick is reputable. Mr. Kirke's wife knows her. Then I will write to her this morning." She turned toward the door. "Cecily," he said. She turned back. He crossed the room in 4 steps. He cupped her face in both hands this time, and he kissed her with the deliberateness of a man who had spent 5 years not doing so, and intended to be thorough about the correction. It was a brief kiss, and a warm one, and it contained within it the full weight of 5 years' worth of absence, and she pressed her hand flat against his chest and felt his heart and thought, for the first time in a very long time, that the ground might actually hold. "Thursday," he said against her hair. "Bring the child on Saturday. I would like to meet my daughter before we dine with the county." She went out and closed the door again. And this time she stood in the corridor for a moment before she moved, because the hall was empty, and she was permitted, she thought, 1 moment of something she had not allowed herself in a very long time. Something that was not quite happiness yet, but was happiness's immediate precursor, the sensation of a door standing open. Then she straightened her dress and went to find Mrs. Kirke. Eleanor arrived on Saturday afternoon in a hired carriage, with Agnes and a considerable amount of luggage for a 4-year-old, which was a characteristic that Cecily had stopped being surprised by. Eleanor descended the carriage steps with the careful deliberateness of a child who has been told to be careful and has interpreted the instruction in the most technical possible sense, and she stood in the courtyard of Ashbrook Park and looked up at the facade with the gray eyes that had caused her mother such difficulty, and said with perfect clarity, "It is very large." "It is," Cecily agreed. "Does the man who lives here know we are coming?" "He does." "Does he know about me?" "He does." Eleanor considered this. "Is he nice?" Cecily had been considering that question for 5 days. "He is very precise," she said, "and very quiet. And he will expect you to be honest with him because he considers honesty the most important quality a person can possess. Other than that, I think you will form your own opinion." Eleanor accepted this with the equanimity of a child who has spent 4 years forming her own opinions and has found the practice reliable. The Marquess met them in the drawing-room rather than the library, which was a choice that cost him something. The drawing-room was the room he liked least in the house, associated as it was with formal occasions and the particular quality of performance that formal occasions require. He stood by the fireplace when they entered, and his eyes went to Eleanor immediately, and stayed there with the careful quality of a man examining something he very much wants to be certain about. Eleanor looked at him. "You have the same eyes as me," she announced. Something in his face cracked very quietly, the way things crack when they have been held in tension for a long time, and the tension is finally, carefully released. "I do," he said. He came down to her level, which required him to go on one knee, and looked at her directly. "My name is Henry. I'm told your name is Eleanor." "It is." "I was named for a woman of great steadiness." She paused. "My mother told me so." He looked up at Cecily over the child's head. The look lasted exactly long enough. "Your mother," he said, "is a woman of considerable judgment." He took Eleanor's hand, and she allowed it, and they walked together toward the window that looked out at the south lawn, and he told her in the level, precise voice that had always contained more warmth than the surface of it suggested, about the 2 horses in the stable whose names she might like to know and the kitchen garden where the gardener grew something Eleanor was very likely to enjoy, and the room in the east wing that had good light and could be arranged if she liked, in whatever manner suited her. Agnes sat beside Cecily and said nothing, which was the wisest thing Agnes had ever done. The Caldwell dinner took place on the following Thursday, as intended. Cecily wore blue, which she had not worn in 5 years, in the specific shade that the dressmaker had produced, with a confidence that suggested Mrs. Kirk had provided rather precise instruction. She stood in the entry hall before they left, and felt the weight of the house around her in a way that was different from the weight it had carried 4 days ago. Less reproachful, more simply present. He offered his arm. She took it. The dinner was a long table, 12 guests, candlelight on silver, and the particular quality of attention that a Warwickshire County dinner applies to anything that departs from the expected. She sat at the far end from him as convention required, and she felt the room arrive at its collective awareness of her over the course of the first course, and she kept her hand still and her expression composed and ate her soup. Across the table, Lady Forston, who was 63 years old and had the quality of attention of a woman who had never found anything she could not name, looked at her directly. "You are," the older woman said, in the particular carrying voice of a woman who has spent a lifetime arranging for important things to be heard, "the Marchioness." It was not a question. She did not ask questions. She already knew the answers to. "I am," Cecily said. The older woman held her gaze for a long moment and then nodded once, with the precise economy of a woman who has reviewed the available evidence and arrived at a judgment. She picked up her wine glass. The woman to Cecily's left, who had been holding a slightly frozen expression since Cecily sat down, made a small adjustment to her posture, as though recalibrating. At the far end of the table, the Marquess was talking to the Viscount Caldwell. He did not look at her. He did not need to. This was the thing about precise people. They did not require display. He had brought her here. He had put her on his arm in the hall. He had introduced her formally to the Viscount and Viscountess as his wife, and the sentence had contained within it the full weight of an irrevocable public fact, offered without apology or explanation to a room that was perfectly capable of drawing its own conclusions. The room was drawing them. She ate her soup. She answered the woman's questions about the management of Ashbrook Park with the particular fluency of a woman who had spent the previous week reacquainting herself with the pantry accounts, and the woman across listened, with the expression of a woman revising an opinion she had held for 5 years, and the revision appeared to be favorable. By the fish course, the table had redistributed its attention to other things. By the remove, she caught his eye across the length of the table, and he held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and she looked away first because 2 seconds was about as much as she could manage without losing her composure entirely, and composure was something she had decided she would maintain for the rest of the evening as a matter of personal principle. The carriage home was cold, and the road was dark, and Eleanor would be asleep in the east wing with a good light, and Agnes would have seen her to bed, and the house would be quiet. He did not speak on the road home. He did not need to. She sat beside him in the carriage and looked at the dark Warwickshire fields and thought about the physician's letter, which was now in his desk, and the portrait in the hall which she rather thought could stay exactly where it was, and the 4 years she had spent being small and provisional and ready to leave. She was not going to leave. That was a new thought. She turned it over. She examined it from all the angles a woman develops after 5 years of examining everything very carefully. And she found it solid. She put her hand in his. His hand closed over hers without any ceremony at all, with the quiet, certain authority of a man reclaiming something that had always been his and had simply been for a time out of reach. He looked out at the dark fields. She looked at them too. Ashbrook Park received them an hour later. Lights burning in the lower windows. The footman with the door before the carriage had fully stopped. The hall was warm. The portrait looked down from above the staircase, and Cecily looked back at it this time without flinching, and then she walked past it toward the staircase, because the portrait was 5 years ago, and the house was tonight. And tonight was entirely different. She paused at the foot of the staircase. She looked back at him. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention she had first noticed 8 months into their marriage, as though she were the room's most interesting fixture, and as though he had only recently given himself permission to find her so. "Henry!" she said. The name in her voice was a marked event. She heard it land. He came to her. He stood on the bottom step so that they were very nearly level, which was something she had forgotten he used to do. And his hands came to her shoulders the way they had in the library, with that same unhurried exactness. "Good!" he said quietly. "You are still here." She laughed. It surprised her. She had not laughed in a library or a hall of this house since she was 23 years old. It came out small and startled and warm. "I am still here," she agreed. The fire burned in the library. Somewhere in the east wing, Eleanor slept with her father's gray eyes closed, dreaming whatever 4-year-old daughters dream in houses that have decided to be their home. The October frost was on the south lawn outside, but the hall was warm, and the portrait was quiet, and the house had stopped holding itself in the tense stillness of a place waiting for something it had not dared to name. If this story found its way to you, leave a word in the quiet below. It is a small thing, and it matters. The linen register stayed on the hall table until morning, when Cecily moved it to the housekeeper's office, because old habits are not easily broken, and because someone had to keep the accounts. She found, going through the household books, that first full week, that the pantry expenditure had been more manageable than she initially estimated, and that the stabling costs were reasonable, and that the wages were fair, and that the east wing required new curtains in 2 rooms, which she ordered from the draper in Warwick, alongside the dressmaker's commission. Eleanor said on the following Monday that the horses' names were fine, but that she would have chosen differently. Henry said, without any perceptible change in expression, that the horses' opinions on the matter had not been solicited. Eleanor considered this. "Can horses have opinions?" "I find," he said, "that most creatures do." Eleanor went away satisfied with this answer, and Cecily set down the household book she had been reviewing and looked at him across the room, and he looked back at her in the way that cost him nothing now, openly, with the quiet certainty of a man who has finally, carefully, stopped managing his own attention. Outside, the October light moved across the south lawn. The house was warm. The accounts were in order. The curtains in the east wing would arrive before Christmas, and Eleanor would be consulted on their color, and the county would have the winter to accustom itself to the return of the Marchioness of Ashbrook, and the older woman would help it along in her efficient carrying way because she had decided she rather liked the name she had arrived at. The worn miniature that Henry wore in his breast pocket, the one with the small painted portrait of a woman she had recognized the first time she glimpsed it as her own face at 23, was placed on the mantelpiece in the library. On the following Thursday morning, in the particular way of things restored to where they have always belonged. She did not ask him to move it. She did not ask him about it at all. She simply looked at it, and he looked at her, and the fire burned, and that was enough. She had not expected in those first days how much the house would remember her. Not in the sentimental way of stories, where rooms retain some atmospheric ghost of those who once inhabited them. She meant something more practical in that her hand went to the correct drawer in the linen cupboard without looking. The way she knew to compensate for the sticking latch on the pantry door before she reached it, The way she moved through the service passages without the hesitation that marked a person new to a floor plan. She had learned this house as a bride. She had learned it with the particular thoroughness of a young woman who understood that the management of a great house was as much the work of a marchioness as any social obligation, and who had applied herself to the learning because applying herself to things was what she did when she was uncertain about everything else. She had been quite uncertain about everything else. The marriage had been arranged with the swiftness that characterized alliances in which both parties have something the other party requires. Her father, the late Baronet Vane, had debts. The late Marquess, Henry's father, had wished for his son to marry before he died, and had exerted the particular pressure available to dying men. Cicely had been 19 years old and had known Henry Ashbrook for 6 weeks, and had understood with the matter-of-fact clarity that sometimes arrives in girls who have spent their lives watching practical consequences operate on people they love, that she was going to marry him whether she loved him or not, and that she might as well try to love him, because the alternative was a life spent resenting a man who had not chosen the circumstances either. She had not expected to love him as quickly as she did. He had been, from the beginning, surprising. Not warm, exactly. Not in the manner of men who make warmth a social tool. He was precise where other men were expansive, and quiet where other men were declarative. And she had come to understand over the course of their courtship that his silence was not indifference but the opposite of indifference. That he was a man to whom everything registered, and who had decided very young that registration did not require announcement. He noticed when her glove was too tight. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He noticed when the conversation at dinner required her to suppress an opinion she held strongly. And he had the habit, afterward, of finding a moment in private to ask her what the suppressed opinion had been, and to listen to it with the expression of a man who has no intention of being astonished and frequently is. She had been in love with him before the wedding. She had spent 5 years being very careful not to think about this directly. The 8th month of their marriage had been the last good month. In the 9th month she had been given information by a physician that she had not known how to receive, and had made the mistake of receiving it in a way that her mother-in-law witnessed and misread, and the misreading had been carried to Henry in a form that the Dowager Marchioness had chosen, with the particular care of a woman who loved her son, in the manner of women who have decided their love gives them authority over his happiness. The Dowager had not been a wicked woman. She had been a woman whose whole life had organized itself around a single priority, and the priority had told her incorrectly that his wife was a danger to it. Cecily had understood this even at the time. Understanding it had not made the blue drawing room any less cold. The 4 days between the 2 Thursday mornings had required her to manage not only the practical dimensions of the household but also the particular discipline of being in the same building as a man she had loved for 5 years, at a distance that was now 12 feet or 20 feet, or occasionally the length of the entrance hall, which was 50 feet at minimum, and in each case the distance felt both enormous and negligible, in a way that was not helpful to composure. She heard his step in the corridor above the housekeeper's office and had to remind herself, firmly and repeatedly, that she was a professional woman in a position of employed responsibility, and not a 19-year-old girl who had spent 6 weeks learning how to be in the same room as the most serious man she had ever met. She was somewhat more successful at this reminder on some days than others. Mr. Kirke, who was a perceptive man, said nothing about any of this, which was the most considerate thing he could have done. On the 3rd day she had gone to the East Wing to inspect the rooms there because the rooms required inspection and because the East Wing was the furthest point in the house from the library, and she had stood in the largest of the East Wing rooms and looked at the light coming through the south-facing window and thought simply, "This is the room. This is the room with the good light. This is the room she would want, if there was a she to want it." She had not let herself follow that sentence further. She followed it. Now on the Monday after the Caldwell dinner, standing in the doorway of the East Wing room while Eleanor stood in the center of it and turned slowly, surveying with the particular expression of a 4-year-old conducting a formal assessment. "The window is very large," Eleanor said. "It is. I could put my drawing table there." Eleanor pointed at the south-facing wall. "And my book's there." "The east wall. And Agnes could have the small room next door, if she comes to stay." "Agnes has her own home," Cecily said. "She could have 2 homes," Eleanor said, with the confidence of a child who has not yet encountered a reason why this would not be practical. "People can have 2 homes. We have 2 homes now. We have Agnes's home, and this home." Cecily looked at her daughter in the good light. "We have this home," she said, correcting gently, because precision mattered and because some corrections, made early and quietly, saved a great deal of complication later. Eleanor accepted this with equanimity. She went to the south-facing window and pressed her nose against the glass and looked at the lawn below. "There are horses," she reported. "There are. I am going to name the one with the white foot Persephone." "You may suggest it." "I am going to suggest it very firmly." From the corridor behind her, Cecily heard a sound that was, just barely, the sound of a man suppressing amusement with only partial success. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Eleanor at the window and felt the warmth of his presence at the doorway behind her, the way she had always felt it as a particular quality of attention that the room took on when he entered it. "Persephone is a reasonable name for a horse," he said. Eleanor turned from the window. She looked at him with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that directness requires apology. "Did you know my mother before I was born?" A pause. The particular quality of his pauses. "I did," he said. "Did you like her?" Another pause. Longer. And waited was something Eleanor was too young to fully receive but old enough to register, because she looked between the two of them with the gray eyes that saw everything and settled back on the window with the tact of a person who has understood that some questions have been answered more completely than the words. "Very much," he said. The East Wing room held that answer in its light, for a moment. Then Eleanor returned to the matter of the horse's name, and Henry came to stand beside Cecily at the window, and outside on the south lawn the October morning continued its patient work. This is what it was, in the end. Not a verdict overturned in a single dramatic moment, though there had been moments of that too. Not a rescue, though rescue was part of it. It was 2 people in a room with good light, and a child at the window naming horses, and the accounts on the desk down the corridor that still required balancing and the curtains to be ordered for these rooms before the cold fully arrived. It was a house. Resumed the miniature on the library mantelpiece caught the firelight in the evenings. The portrait above the staircase looked down on a hall that had stopped holding its breath. Eleanor learned the horse's name was Biscuit, and the negotiation over Persephone lasted 3 days and ended in a compromise that satisfied no one, and both of them entirely, as compromises do. By Christmas, the county had settled into its new understanding. By spring, the East Wing curtains were hung. By the following October, Eleanor had learned that her father could be persuaded to read to her in the library if she brought the book, and did not interrupt him more than twice in the first chapter, which was, she reported to Agnes in a letter that Cecily found entirely unnecessary to read, but read anyway, a perfectly reasonable number of interruptions. The linen register was kept in the housekeeper's office still, because someone had to, and the someone turned out to be Cecily, who found that the management of a great house was as much the work of a marchioness as she had always known it to be, and who attended to it with the same thoroughness she had applied when she was 19 years old, and uncertain about everything except the value of doing the work in front of her. Well, she was not 19 years old now. She was not uncertain. The miniature stayed on the mantelpiece. The house was warm. She was still here,